Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hi, we are very happy to have with us today Forrest Shull from the Fraunhofer Center in Maryland. So Forrest is actually one of Vic Pesilli's students, and he got his PhD from the University of Maryland. Prior to that, he was at Loyola College in Maryland too. Forrest is the division director of the Knowledge Management Division at Fraunhofer. He's going to talk to us today about some of his work on building bodies of knowledge in software development processes.
Okay, thanks, Nachi. Okay, so as Nachi said, the talk I went to give today is about the idea of building up bodies of knowledge about practices. A lot of the work I've been doing over the last 10, 12 years or so, I guess, has been empirically studying how do we get an understanding of how effective or how costly or what kind of defects various practices that we can use for software development might be. And I think as a community, the empirical software community has been pretty good, I think, about improving ourselves over time, running case studies, running controlled experiments that help us get insight into these things. But the next frontier, if you will, for the community is how do we put these studies together in order so that we can say something robust and useful about these practices in a lot of different circumstances. So a lot of what I've been doing has really been driven by how can we communicate some of these neat studies that we're doing in the labs that we publish in the research papers. How do we really communicate interesting findings from these out to the engineers that can use them and really find the results interesting and hopefully make decisions based on them? So the way I realized I should have motivated this talk a little differently. So let me back up and say the reason I started to put these slides together is that in 2003, Congress issued a directive to the Department of Defense that they needed to have a central clearinghouse, that they called it, so that they could recommend practices for software engineers, for software acquisition professionals, and for system engineers, that they could recommend practices and have the evidence behind them, so that you could make recommendations, that you could choose the right practices for your project based on an evidence-based approach rather than gut feeling or instinct or vendors. DoD came to us to help them figure out how to do this request. And so the work that we've done here is really driven by how can we come up with a system for the DoD that can make some of these recommendations available and useful, that people can come and understand what's the evidence for various practices and where they're going to work. Okay, so to do that, what I went to do is put some motivating slides together. Obviously, the work that I've done has been in software engineering, and so most of the examples here are in a software flavor. And what I wanted to talk about was a couple different methodological things that we've learned from trying to abstract conclusions across bodies of knowledge. So I'm going to put a couple of different studies up here on different topics, and I hope you'll forgive me a little bit because I'm going to jump from topic to topic. But the important thing here is really the methodology and how we're trying to put them together. Okay, so to give you a sense of why this is hard, first I'll talk in a little bit more detail than some of the others about software inspections and the body of knowledge there, what kind of studies are out there, how they fit together. Then I'll switch gears a little bit and say, well, we've tried to do it better by designing studies a priori to fit together. And we did that in the area of high-performance computing, so I'll give you an insight into what we did there. And then I'll briefly mention some other more rigorous techniques that folks have used for looking at requirements engineering techniques and for pair programming. Okay. And then I'll come back at the end and say, well, what have we learned from these studies that helped us to build the system? And I'll show you where we are there and give you some kind of lessons learned that as we've gone forward with building the system, we've learned from the practitioners that are going to be using it. Okay, so first just a bit about me. Actually, Nachi gave me a nice introduction, so I won't say too much. I did get my PhD in '98 with Vic as my advisor. In '99, I moved to the Fraunhofer Center, Maryland. It's a small company, maybe 24 people altogether. It's a nonprofit. We're affiliated with the University of Maryland. And our mandate is tech transfer. And so what we try and do is sit in between the universities that are developing nifty new software development techniques and the folks in commercial sites or government sites that should be applying them. And we try and bridge that gap a little bit better. Okay. I mention that just because you'll notice that there's, I think, a lot of tech transfer type of things in the talk, I hope. We've really been kind of wrestling with how we do good research and then make it accessible for the engineers. Currently, I'm Division Director for Measurement and Knowledge Management. We've done a lot of research grants. We've worked for NSF, NASA's Office of Safety and Mission Assurance, DARPA. We've worked with teams at NASA, Fujitsu, Defense Department, a lot of other places, actually, trying to get them to use the technologies, trying to understand how well the technologies work in their environments. Worked on a lot of different topics. And I just wanted to put a little plug here. For the last couple months, I've been writing a column for IEEE Software Magazine, which is trying to do exactly this. Look across a body of knowledge, make it accessible for practitioners. I've been trying out a couple of different ideas there, and so if people have a chance to take a look and give me some feedback as to how we're going as we build this column, it would be something I would find very valuable. Okay. So just one slide is a brief introduction to empirical software engineering. If you've seen talks from other empirical software engineers, this probably looks familiar because it's one slide that we've come up with that kind of encapsulates our basic approach to life. At heart, what we're trying to do is apply the scientific method to reasoning about software engineering practices. And that means that we're trying to take a look at observing, understanding how people actually use the things and what we can measure, what we can learn about how effective or not they are. Building models that try and encapsulate the knowledge and make it useful. Experimenting, so if we have an idea how we might improve it, we introduce it in a controlled way. We do further measurement to see if we actually made an improvement or not. And then hopefully evolving, that as we learn more things, we try and have an effect on the practice. And then we iterate, because then this evolution becomes the next baseline. Okay? And we try and understand now what's there, how we could improve, what kind of, depending on the topic, what kind of defects we're catching. Basically, we don't limit we like to work with quantitative data, most of us, but we also look at qualitative things, doing surveys, interviews with folks in the field. And really, what we need for this is real-world laboratories. So this is not an approach that you can really work with at the university, kind of cut off from the rest of the world. But we do get out there and really try and work with the engineers that are out there in the field that can give us the information we need and that can help us understand what's really going on with these techniques. Okay. So some of the points I'd like to make, I hope you'll take away before the end of the presentation. There's no one-size-fits-all solutions in software engineering, is one of my deep and abiding beliefs. Even if there's things that work for most teams, like, for example, independent reviews, I think, of coming in and taking an independent look at the technical work you're doing, I think we can't actually go out there and say that's going to work for 100% of the teams. Teams that are on a tight budget, that are doing rapid prototyping, there's no solution out there that's going to be recommended for everybody. A lot of what I'm going to talk about relies on measurement. And even though it's not perfect, there's a lot of troubles when we try and measure things in the field, when people have time constraints, when it's people that are applying the technologies, it gets very difficult. But some information is better than none, and we think we have a good way of getting some of this out. That measurement can aid technology transfer. A lot of what we do relies on looking at things in controlled situations in the first place, understanding, using measurement to help us understand whether they're good or not, and then growing it, helping it deploy from there. That if I want to make real practical decisions, if I want to advocate different techniques for use in different places, I really need robust data sets, which means I need more than one study. I really need a body of information that I can put together and abstract some conclusions from. And finally, there's not perfect techniques, and I'll show you some of the ways we're trying to struggle to get a hold of this, but effective techniques that exist for helping me do those abstractions. Okay. So the first example is software inspections. This is just a brief graph so that we all understand what I mean when I talk about inspections. I have some artifact that I want to get defects out of. I come in and do a planning phase. I have to figure out what's the right part of the artifact to inspect, who are the right people to do it. Hand it off to a number of different inspectors that go look for defects. We come together as a team and collect them. And then finally, the author goes back and fixes the things we agree need to be fixed. Okay. There's been a lot of research work and measurement on software inspections over time. The work that I've done particularly is how do we improve this step here? So I have an artifact, I throw it off to a bunch of smart technical guys. Can I give them some better guidance as to how they're going to find the defects, as to how they can actually get a handle on whether or not this is a high-quality document or not? Okay, so the work that I want to talk about, what I tried to do is organize some of it. I'm a little graphically challenged, so bear with me, please. But what I tried to do here was each box is a study. I had to label them somehow, so if you really want, at the end of the talk, there's a bunch of slides that say which studies these all reference. I organized them by whether they're requirements, design, or code, artifacts that were looked at, and then this is time. So this is earlier, and then studies that come later over to the right somewhere. Okay. This is not to say we think that there has to be a waterfall life cycle. I'm just trying to divide up the world of possibilities here. Okay. So taking a quick look across the body of knowledge, a lot of the research on the reading techniques got kicked off by a study back here by Basili and Selby in '87. Which they did at the University of Maryland. They had professionals from NASA Goddard, a bunch of graduate students there, and they asked them for 3 different pieces of code to apply functional testing, structural testing, and code reading. Interestingly, for the professionals, code reading came out on top, actually. It found the most defects in the least amount of time. Functional or structural tests were about equal. There wasn't a big difference there. But for the students, it didn't really matter which one they did. They weren't doing a better job with one technique or the other anyway. Okay, so at least this let us say, well, reading is actually an effective way of getting defects out. By doing reading, I did better than actually relying on tests to find the defects. There's a problem with the students here. Maybe it's a motivational problem. The students are just doing this kind of weird offline little experiment. We need a way to get them to do a better job. Okay. Next thing they looked at is taking that idea and then said, okay, let's take this to the extreme. So let's have a bunch of developers that can do nothing but code reading. Okay, they called this the clean room approach. Okay. So what they found when I compared clean room teams to teams that could develop code and then test it before handing it off to the next guy, clean room teams actually did much better. They met more of the functional requirements. They met their intermediate deadlines. But then interestingly, 86% of those guys said, oh, maybe it was more effective, but this is really an unnatural way of developing software. I really hate the fact that I'm coding away and I can't compile it at the end of the day. I can't test the darn thing. So, there was good research results, but the actual engineers in the study were complaining a bit. But, let's just say, well, there's something to this reading thing. We can get good results here if we just look at defect numbers. There's some kind of cultural shift that has to go along. We need a better handle on that. But it's promising. Right. So the next study, they took this clean room idea and then piloted it at NASA Goddard. So this paper here, this Basili 97, actually talks about a series of 4 studies. First, where they did a pilot project where folks on a real development project could only use clean room. And they modified it a little bit. So you could do some compilation and then unit testing before you had to hand it off to someone else to test your stuff. So that modified the coders a little bit there.
It would be sort of boring to sit around finding syntax errors that the compiler could.
That's exactly the reasoning. I mean, so the not allowing them to compile it was, I think, too extreme. But then you get to the next level where you're saying, well, you can do some unit code, some unit testing. I'm sorry, that was the more important point there. Go ahead.
And so this goes to the empirical method. I mean, how do you know? So clean room, in some sense, is a whole bunch of little ideas bundled together, right?
Yes, exactly.
And how do you know what to attribute the effect to? So, for example, it could have been a psychological effect. If I'm not even allowed to compile my code, I could be so paranoid about errors that I'm just in a very attentive place when I write the code.
Right.
Whereas if you allow me to compile it, suddenly there's this psychological crutch that, the compiler will catch my bugs, right?
Yes.
So that could have been the critical ingredient to the success of clean room, and how do you know, right?
That's a very good thing. But usually we say it a little bit more positively. That in a way, I know someone else is going to be testing the code, and I don't want to be embarrassed. So I am going to do a better job. Kind of going through line by line, using human reasoning. In a better way to make sure the algorithm's actually correct, to make sure the thing is there, and I'm not going to get dinged with a lot of stupid defects when I hand it off to someone else to test. But that's exactly the point, though. And what you'll see is that what we did was then took a piece of it in these later studies and tried to test it individually to say, is this really, is this reading idea really the idea, or was it just that, we're in an experimental context, we have a Hawthorne effect, I want this to work out, or like you said, I'm afraid of failure, and so I'm going to really, go to an unnatural length to really get the defects out. Let's see. So in the NASA context, again, we saw a reduced failure rate. The folks were a little bit happier. They could do the unit testing. They were more productive. But the interesting thing is then when they took a look at the defects people were getting out, it was all over the place. So people could look at the same code and find completely different sets of defects, which makes you think, At least it made those guys think. That reading seems to be a good way to do this. That's an effective approach. It's getting the defects. But I'm a little nervous that it's such an uncontrolled mechanism. That how do I have any kind of guarantee that people are going to find all the defects that are there if everyone's kind of all over the map? Okay. Which leads us to this next study. And this is where now I got involved. This was part of my dissertation, actually, back in whenever this was, 97, I guess. What we did was exactly that. We stripped away the rest of the clean room stuff. We took out the code reading idea. And I'll show you in just a minute how we set up the experiment. But here, what we found was that the inspections, when I had when I had a more tailored reading technique, what we tried to do was get some control over it, give people a much more procedural way to actually go through and do the defect detection, and then see if that actually made the improvement or not. And what we found there was for most of the situations we looked at, the structured reading found more defects than when I did it without that. Okay.
Sorry, I'm a little confused because we actually shifted there from code to requirements documents, right? So can you say a little bit more about what people were actually doing with the documents and what they were, what's the substitute for code here? I mean,
yeah, so what we had, for the NASA projects we were working with, what they had were natural language English requirements. So it was a bunch of the software shall, that kind of issue. Right. So we picked up, what we found was that even though they were using the clean room thing here, the clean room approach, most of the defects that NASA was worrying about were not actually at the coding level. I think time and again what we found is that by the time I get to coding, I have a bunch of good coders. They do a good job with it. Yes, there's defects we have to worry about, but the real things that tended to trip them up were bad requirements, bad design documents. And so what we were trying to say was, well, we have some idea from these studies that this inspection reading idea looks like a good thing. Let's see if we can pick up the core piece of it, the idea that we can ask people to read in a structured way, give them a procedure for looking through that document, and that we can give them that we can try and control this fact that they're finding defects all over the place by giving them a specific perspective at the same time, and apply that to the requirements documents that were there. Okay. So what we did this twice. We had 25 experienced developers from NASA both times. And again, what we asked them to do was we gave them a very procedural approach for looking through the document to find defects. We had basically came up with this idea of 3-person teams where each person on the team takes a different stakeholder's point of view. So someone's going to be a designer, someone's going to pretend they're a tester, someone's going to be a user. So I can constrain them a little bit. They don't have to worry about finding every defect out there in the world. But at the same time, they have a very more specific focus of what to look for. We had 4 different requirements documents that we looked at in the experiment. 2 that were pieces of real things from NASA. 2 that were more generic things we had used at the university. So an ATM and a parking garage system, basically. And each of these had seeded defects in it, some of which we put in there, some of which we knew that had been put in as people were developing the documents in the first place. And then what we were looking at was trying to measure the defect detection rate. So how many of those defects that we know were out there are people actually going to go find? Okay. The study that we did, this was part of a training course, and so we were able to get the NASA folks for this that way. We gave them a bit of training first off in defect types. We wanted to have a baseline that everyone's out there looking for the same types of things, so we didn't want to bias the study one way or the other that way. We asked them to use their usual approach for reviewing a NASA document. We asked them to use their usual approach for reviewing one of these generic guys. Then we gave them training in the reading technique, and then asked them again, look at a generic document, look at a NASA document. Okay. So for each person, we could see what was the improvement on each of these topics from the before training to the after training. Okay, so it was a within subject study. Now the problem was we didn't have really much faith about how difficult these documents were to look at. So we were afraid we could easily bias the study if we put all the easy documents here and all the hard ones up here. So what we ended up doing was dividing the folks in 2. So some of them looked at the B documents first, some of them looked at the A documents first, and then they all switched. And what we found, so again, we did this twice. So here's what we found on the generic documents and in the NASA document in the first study, and then the generic in the NASA documents in the second one. What you can see is that for the generic documents, the teams were finding many more defects with the reading technique than they were with the usual one. Okay. For the generic ones only, I mean, there's a bit of a jump here and a bit of a jump from 48 to 62 over there. With the NASA documents, though, not so much. I mean, here there was really nothing. This was not at all statistically significant, of course. And then in the 95 study, they had done a little better, but it still wasn't within the realm of being statistically significant. So what we took away from this was that, again, the reading seems to work fine under certain circumstances, but not the others. We went back and did a series of structured interviews with the subjects after the fact. And what we found was at least an indication that because we had given them a set amount of time to go read through the documents and find the defects, that when they had something that looked like what they saw on a normal daily basis, and they had a time limit, they kind of fell back on what they knew was going to be effective anyway. So we gave them a nice procedural technique. They said, gee, that's great, but I only have an hour to review the document, or whatever it was. So they kind of put that aside and went and did what they normally did anyway. And so you can see it doesn't really make much difference whether we thought they were using usual or we thought they were using reading, because in the end they were really doing more or less the same thing both times. The conclusion that we draw from that was that when I'm looking at something where I don't have much familiarity, when I don't have as much experience about the types of defects that are out there, and I need a crutch to rely on, then if I give you some procedural guidance, that'll actually be helpful.
So if I'm new to a project, for example,
exactly.
That would be.
But once you got used to the project, you would stop using this technique?
What we ended up wanting to do was that if we could interview the more experienced folks and take their knowledge and put it back into the more procedural guidance, then exactly what you said. We could give it to the new guys on the team. They need the crutch. We'd like to, they can benefit from the experience of the more people who are more used to these types of documents, these types of reviews. And then as I get better, either I don't really need that guidance anymore, or better yet, I can try and keep it updated so that we as a team have a little bit of a mini knowledge repository, for example, about what it makes sense to look for, what kind of defects come up over time.
I guess I'm just sort of a little, I don't know, I'm just having a little trouble with the sort of conclusion that the technique is effective if, people don't actually want to apply it because their perception is that it's not going to help them. Mm-hmm. And only in circumstances where they're totally at sea do they fall back on the technique. Because typically you would want more experienced people reviewing your requirements. Presumably they would be more effective at it.
And domain experts as well.
And domain experts.
What we were dealing with here was a situation at NASA where they would have loved to get these experienced people on the team, but the experienced people were few and far between, and they're being asked to review just about every darn thing. So the question was, well, how can we unload some of that workload from them? So the more hopeful takeaway here, I think, was that if we could kind of capture some of that knowledge and put it so that we could bring the more inexperienced people up a little bit of a level, we could share the workload around. We don't have to rely on those experienced people all the time. I think that what you're saying is exactly right, that we would never say that we're coming up with a substitute for the experienced people, that we can take an inexperienced guy and make them just as good as those experienced folks. But rather, I think we'd like to approach this from the point of view of saying, the experienced folks are valuable assets, and we would like to learn from them and pull that into the procedural technique.
I mean, you seem to be conflating inexperienced and unfamiliar, because I assume that these people were not all inexperienced new hires, but they were unfamiliar with the generic documents. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, can you separate out the two?
Well, we certainly tried. I mean, we went back and we looked at, now we didn't give them a pre-test, so we really couldn't say anything about what their effectiveness was coming into this, unfortunately.
You had some idea how long they were employed by NASA?
We had some idea of how long they were there, and we asked them how long they had been at NASA, how long they had been doing this type of work at NASA, and then how many inspections they had been on. And what we found was that none of those things allowed us to predict who was going to do a good job and who not. So we were a bit disappointed at that. But what we did see, and again, maybe one of the things to look at here also, is that when they did a good job, so these are our Venn diagrams. So I tried to take all the defects that they found. So 2 of those defects were found only by designers, 3 were found only by the users, 5 by the testers, and there were 4 that were found by someone from all those different perspectives. So when the reading inspection techniques actually had a win, you could see that there was things out here in the leaves. So some of these guys were finding things that the other stakeholders were not finding at all. And then when I put them together on the team, they did a much better job of getting coverage out there. The cases where there wasn't any benefit to the reading, you can see this one, the numbers are just low all over. This one, all the numbers end up in this overlap here. So people are kind of doing the same thing again, I think. They're out there looking for defects. They're just finding the easy ones, perhaps, and that's why we're seeing all this overlap. So what we've been trying to say since then is, at least there's a question about whether the procedure, to what extent the proceduralism really helps. That's one of the variables here. But for sure, what it seems like is I can do a much better job if I can give people the unique stakeholder points of view. And I can bring them together where they're each not responsible for finding everything in the document, because that just overwhelms people. But they can worry about a specific slice of it, slice in a virtual sense, meaning things that are going to be related to my perspective. And then we come together and we get a win at the team level. Okay. What I should also say, I didn't show a graph, but we also found that the individual inspectors did much better here with the reading than they did using their normal approach. And again, from the interviews, a lot of what seemed to be coming out of that was, I have a smaller focus. I don't have to worry about everything in the world, but I just have to worry about things related to me, and I can ignore parts of it and go deeper on the other pieces of the document. Okay. So from that point of view, the inspectors actually did like the perspective-based approach, at least. Okay. Now, that study is actually one of the probably most replicated studies in software engineering. Well, at least in empirical software engineering, let me say. And I tried to graph here. So these are the 4 studies we just looked at, and I've squished them over on the left side here. On the right, I tried to put at least some of the studies that came out of this work. And you can see people took this idea of the procedural techniques and then applied it to requirements documents, to design documents, to code documents. And the other here was websites, I think, website usability. Okay. So this idea that, there seems to be some promise here to having a more focused, more procedural reading technique. Now let's see if we can take it and apply it in all these different problem domains. And so what we find, actually, is that the results were promising enough as I go forward. Well, I can color it here, but I'm sorry, by which of these were done in the industry and which in the classroom. And what you find is that when you look, just like in here, we had a nice feature where I tried something out in the classroom. I piloted that clean room thing at NASA. And then it actually got in use on a number of different projects. I can start to see that same issue or that same type of situation coming up again and again. So here was someone who applied the reading techniques. This was a study I was involved with, actually. We tried to look at object-oriented designs. Someone else picked this up and applied it to a state government project in Brazil, I think, and then it was actually put in use at Ericsson in Sweden. Here's another one where we kept working on these requirements documents for a while. Then we applied it again in a case study at NASA. That was for flight software. It was the SO3. And then in SO4, it actually got used on inspecting software that monitors the electrical power on the International Space Station. Okay. Now, the difficult thing to see here, though, is that, the issue you brought up earlier was correct, that there's it's not really a package deal, that there's different pieces of this that might be causing the benefit and others not. There's a difficulty that some of these were case studies, like the SO3, SO4. Some of these were controlled experiments, like the one back here that I showed you. So we can't really just dump all the data together and say, OK, look, every time I gave it to these guys, the perspective-based approach to these guys, they did better, and every time I asked these people to do it with their usual approach, they did worse. I can't just really make all one big data set out of it and do that. I can't really do anything really statistically rigorous, where I put these all together and say, well, across all these different studies, this always won, because that wasn't actually the case. We did see some of the studies where reading didn't seem to work for whatever reason. There were fewer of those than the ones where it did work, though. So in general, at least, you could say, well, there's something promising going on here. At least convince people to pick it up, try it out, and change their actual practice based on this. But it's a little bit hard to say, well, how rigorous is that conclusion? This makes a nice kind of related work section of a paper, but it's really hard to, to say how rigorous our conclusion is here. So that was the first example. Let me I'll leave this issue here just to kind of say a little bit about how, geez, this is a complicated problem, trying to put all this together. So having learned from that experience, what we did a little bit later. This was in 2005. We had a project for DARPA. And we tried to learn from that earlier study, not about the inspections per se, but about how we do studies in a good way. And what we wanted to do here was to look at how we can build up knowledge about how productive people are in developing codes for supercomputers, so for doing high-end computing. There was a lot of work previously that looked at how I can work in these parallel environments and get the execution time of a program down. Okay, there hadn't been a lot of work about, well, for some of these solutions that I come up with over there, well, how does that impact the actual programmer's time? It might be a very efficient algorithm or a very efficient way of sending messages back and forth, but geez, it's so complicated and imposes so much overhead that it actually drives up the time it takes to build the thing and increases the defect rate, one might say. So we had a series of studies we wanted to design based on this particular type of thing. And what we thought was, well, maybe we can be a little bit smarter this time. We've seen kind of in an ad hoc way how these studies can build on each other with the inspection stuff. Perhaps we can try and design a set of studies a priori that are going to build up knowledge, and we can have a more rigorous basis for things here. Okay. So the two variables we had, kind of doing this meta study in a way, we had different types of studies we could put together. So controlled experiments, where I can look at something in the small and get hopefully a more rigorous answer under controlled conditions. Do observational studies, where we actually go into the field, sit with the engineers that are developing things, understand how they do it. Surveys, interviews, and focus groups, so trying to collect some kind of qualitative information from folks across a larger field. Case studies and field studies, again, where we look at maybe one program and try and follow it for a longer time and get a better, more rigorous basis for what's going on there. So this was one dimension in a way. The second dimension, we had access to a number of different types of applications. So there's little classroom assignments that as people are taught how to develop supercomputer codes, they look at things like game of life, parallel sorting, so very small problems just to build up your understanding. Going up to compact apps, which are really key benchmarks that folks have come up with, most of these from the national labs, to try and understand on different architectures, different programming approaches, how well the solution is going to perform. All the way up to full scientific applications. So we sat with some of the teams, the Flash team up at University of Chicago, for example, trying to understand how they're going about a multi-year project trying to develop codes that predict the performance of supernovas. Okay. So what we thought was we need a kind of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach here. Okay. So we set out to do some some controlled experiments in the first place on classroom assignments. That's not really going to give you the answers you want for the field. It's not a very representative environment, but there was a lot of things we didn't even understand what variables we had to be collecting at that point. Okay? We didn't understand how hard it was going to be to instrument the computers and get some of the data that we were looking for. Okay. Then we sat and did observational studies of people actually doing the classroom assignments, trying to understand at least one-on-one these students that are trying to learn the techniques, how they do it, why we're not getting accurate data, or how accurate the data we are getting is. Going up to controlled experiments at classrooms where we could put either people within the same class to try and do the same problem in different ways, or people across classes to do it. Going up to case studies of the compact apps, interviews with developers. So we were really trying to start small and then build things as we went. Okay, trying to do this in an intelligent, controlled way. All right. And now what we found here was we could get a set of data out. So what I tried to do here was just put for one particular question that we had, which is two approaches that were very popular for building up codes on supercomputers. One, MPI, where you have a lot of control over things and but it requires a lot of code, versus OpenMP, where the compiler handles some of it for you, okay, but you have less code to write. So we tried to look at how those things traded off. So what I've graphed here is the difference in programming effort between those two. So each graph, what I've done is for each subject who developed the same assignment in two different ways, I've subtracted their OpenMP effort from their MPI effort. Okay? So if it ended up at 0, that means the two approaches were more or less equal in terms of the effort they took. Things that are above the line mean that folks took less time with OpenMP than with MPI. And you'll see that's where most of the data falls out.
Equally solvable with message passing and shared memory, because the programming paradigms are quite different.
Yes. Well, what we asked, well, for example, for Game of Life, we would take it and ask someone to do it in MPI first early in the semester and then do the same problem in OpenMP later in the semester, or vice versa. So we weren't trying to compare across different problems, but we were looking at the same problem done different ways.
So I don't understand. So MPI is message passing.
Yes.
OpenMP is shared memory.
Yes, it's loop parallelization.
Oh.
It's basically running the loop WebDo across them.
Oh, I see. Okay. So MP is different in the two things. One, MPI is message passing.
Yes, MPI is message passing.
And OpenMP is.
It's a compiler
What does the MP stand for in OpenMP?
process.
Multiprocessing. Oh, okay. I always thought they were both message passing.
No, the naming is bad. The libraries are horrible.
Okay.
There's lots of things wrong with it.
Sorry, and the single letters here again were what?
I'm sorry. These were just different classes where we took the class off. We didn't want to embarrass anybody in saying this data came from MIT versus University of Maryland or whatever it might be.
Okay, so they're.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure a lot of people would have been interested in that. Maybe more.
Think of them as projects or experiments or.
This is groups of people. This is the sum.
Yes, so each of these is a different group of persons. I think these are all Game of Life, actually. So I'll say these are the same project done.
So they're subject pools.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Okay. So what we found, at one part it looks like, okay, well we have a lot of data. It's the same metrics. Maybe we can throw all this together and do a little bit of a better analysis across all these studies than before. But again, what we actually find is that the procedures, the experiment actually changed enough over time that we feel really like that you can't just combine all these different things. And this is something, because we do this in an iterative fashion, it's very hard to get people replicating the same project over and over again, where we could really do a straight comparison of the same project. So here, what we found was that people were learning, let's say OpenMP first and then MPI later in the semester. So I could look at the two data points and do some kind of comparison there. But the problem becomes, if they learn MPI later in the semester, they're a lot smarter at that point than they were coming in the door. So is that really a fair comparison? But what we had to do was live within the constraints of what people were doing in the classrooms and how they were giving the assignments out. So we kind of lived with it for a while. After a while, we built up more trust with the instructors. I think that was a positive thing. And we tried to control for ordering. So what we asked them to do was to teach both approaches first off. Teach OpenMP, teach MPI, and then let people do it in either order. So there wasn't any intermediate deadlines, but you learned the approaches, then you had to hand in both solutions at the end, and whatever happened in the meantime was not any concern of ours. And what you see here is that suddenly the data is all over the map. So this, from an experimental point of view, was not particularly great for us. The variation between the two suddenly went way kablooey. So then what we tried to do is to come back and control it a little bit better again, where we could teach the two approaches. Half the class got the OpenMP version of the assignment, half the class got the MPI, and then they switched, did each other's thing, and came back at the end with both solutions. So here, finally, we're getting some proper control for ordering. So if I look at these things, I don't want to throw them all together because, in a way, they're not all equally trustable, if you will. So hopefully, going forward now, we can build up a body of knowledge where I can put these all together in one data set, make the argument that they're equally valid in some way, and I can analyze across studies. But trying to put the whole data set together is a little bit dangerous at this point. Okay. So again, I'm going to switch gears for a minute, but just trying to give you some ideas of the difficulties that we faced over time, trying to build up bodies of knowledge across studies. Okay. Oh, the good news, I think, is at least the experiments at the end were better than the ones we started with. So we've learned something as experimenters, at least.
So you say they're better because why? Because there's less variation, or it's more statistically significant? Or what's your notion of better quantitatively?
Yeah, well, that's a good point, actually. I mean, there's two notions of better. One is that the variation is down. So when I look at the data, I can think, okay, there's something. I can understand a little bit better that there's a real effect here. That it's not just that people are all over the place. But secondly, looking at it from the point of view of the experimentation, whether the experiment we ran had the capability of introducing biases or throwing off the data, these experiments were much better than these back here. What we want to do is rule out any potential alternate explanation for the data, let's say.
Yeah.
You know, so going forward, you could say, well, I'm not going to trust any of this data, someone could say, because they learned MPI later on, so they were smarter, they had a leg up.
What was again the last two, the process with the last two?
This was, they learned both of the approaches first up, but then someone said, okay, you have to do the OpenMP solution, and you can do the MPI one. And then a week from now, you hand those in, and we give each of you the opposite assignment. Okay. So we do have these difficulties since we're dealing with human subjects all the time. We have to worry about these types of things with the experimentation. Okay, so let me switch gears here again and talk about two other studies really quickly that tried to handle the same problem. And these were not particular work that I did with the analysis. I just wanted to call them out as examples here. So here's the citation. This was work that some folks at the University of Madrid had done, looking at what we can learn about requirements elicitation techniques. So what kind of techniques I have for sitting with the customer, trying to understand what they really want the software and the system to do in the end. They looked at, well, what they did was look across all the studies they could find that met their criteria. So they came up with 30 studies that spanned 20 years of research. And the hope was, well, across all these 30 studies, we could say something, surely, about which techniques were better and which worse. Why it became difficult, though, was, well, when you broke down these 30 studies, they're actually looking at 43 different techniques. Yes, there was a number of different flavors of doing interviews. There was things like card sorting, where I tried to put different components of the of the system on cards and arrange them as to which ones go together and which things are related. And then when I try to put them together, even at that level, they're looking at 50 different variables. So people might have said, well, we looked at whether or not one approach required less time than the other. But really, one study looked at how much time it was start to finish. Another study looked at how much time it was to sit as a group and sort things out. Another study looked at how much time it was to sit with the customer and sort things out. So what they did, they took an approach more similar to vote counting, actually. So the little bit of a dangerous thing here is they tried to abstract things together. So rather than 43 different techniques, let's look at 7 different types of things. So let's take all of our interview techniques and put them together in one pile. Let's take all the contrived techniques where they're building some kind of strange model, put them together in another pile. And rather than look at 50 different variables, let's say, well, all these guys were looking at some measure of time, for example. So let's put all those together. All these guys were looking at some measure of how many requirements you came up with. Let's put all those together. Okay. So there's some dangers here. I mean, you could think very easily about that example with different time measures. If one study said we reduced the amount of time that people required to sit with the customer, they may have easily really increased the amount of time that I had to spend to do the whole darn process from start to finish. But I don't really have that. So in my data set, it looks like they reduced the time, but I don't know if that's really a fair statement about the study or not. But at least what they were able to get out were some findings, at least at a level of thumb, a rule of thumb or a heuristic level. What they found was that in that interview category, the interviews tended to do much better than any of the other approaches, whichever type of interview I was looking at getting the right number of or getting a number of requirements there that that were, how do I want to say this? They got the most requirements that were deemed to be valid by the users of the system when they evaluated them. Okay. I could look at other types of techniques, sorting, where I have different components and I try and sort them all out to tell you how what are the components of the system and how they fit together. Tended to be much less effective than most of the other ones. Introspective ones, where I sit down and really talk through the problem with the person and get them to give me a lot of information about how they would solve the problem. Again, tended to be less effective. So there's rules of thumbs here that at least we can say, well, most of the projects that we've been talking to are using interviews out in the field. Well, I think there's a good reason for that, actually. I mean, if you look at the data, we can at least say there's no study that should have gone the other way that told me that interviews were less effective than the other alternatives I had. Okay. So again, this is another approach. Again, has its dangers, has its benefits, though. Okay. And then finally, I'll leave with one example that talks about, geez, haven't we ever been able to put data together across studies in one quantitative pot and do some analysis against it? And what I found is exactly one study where they were able to do that. And what they did was look at pair programming, which has been a fairly hot topic in the experimental community for the last several years. The authors found 15 studies over 10 years where they were trying to compare pair programming to doing it without pairs and trying to figure out what the solution was. People were using the same metrics. Of course, you know, they looked at different problems, and so the magnitude of the metrics was different. You know, so what they did was try and normalize it according to the standard deviation within the data set. You know, so if I give you a number like, you know, this study showed a 0.5, that means that the mean of the pairs is half a standard deviation larger than the mean of the individuals. So whatever the exact values were, I can at least tell you relative to each other where those the two groups work out. And then what they could do is, you know, coming back to that idea, is variance an indicator that something's a little wonky there? They took that same approach and assigned each study a weight. So if I had a larger variance, it said to me that there's something more dangerous going on out there. You know, so I'm not going to trust that study as much. Okay. And they were able to get a really nice chart that looks like this. You know, so for quality, now there's different studies in each one, because even within those 15 studies, not everyone looked at a quality metric, for example. But of the ones that did, they could put this all together and say, well, the mean for the whole thing was that the quality of pair programming was, you know, X standard deviations bigger than the quality for solo programming. Okay. The nice thing about looking at the forest graph like this is you can see, you know, the whole data set average was here, and you can see each of the individual studies, you know, where did they really end up contributing to that? You know, so some of these guys, so everyone was, here's the 0 point. So all the studies showed that the mean was, you know, favoring pair programming. You know, you can see for some of them, the confidence interval kind of extends the other way. But for most of them, you know, there's a fairly, you know, how do I want to say? There's a pattern that emerges, right? That all these studies are favoring pair programming, not by a heck of a lot, though, on the other hand.
So all of these represent potentially different measures that have been normalized in some way so that they can appear together?
For these, it was actually, these were all, I think, number of defects, I want to say. The duration was all calendar time. So for once, actually, we were able to find an example, you know, where there's a number of studies out there in the field that measured the same thing. Okay. So and then effort was obviously just person effort. Okay. Yeah. So the results here are interesting, though. I think, you know, the quality, you know, showed a little bit better quality for the pair programming. Actually, you might have expected it to be better. You know, with someone looking over your shoulder all the time, you might have thought that, you know, that both of us would do a better job. But yes.
What do the length and arrows represent?
The 95% confidence interval for that study.
Some of those are huge.
Yes. Well, what you can see is that the ones that are huge, the size of this block shows how much weight was given to that study. Okay. So we.
Smaller confidence intervals and saying they're more trustworthy.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, which is an assumption. The nice thing, at least, of having the quantitative data is you could throw all the data back in the pot and run it differently. You know, I could say I trust them all equally, or some of them I just want to remove from the data set.
Was the confidence interval basically related to the size of the sample or the way the experiment was conducted?
It was certainly related to the way the experiment was conducted. I don't think offhand I looked at whether or not it was related to the number of subjects that was in the study.
So is there some way to do some sort of sensitivity analysis to figure out, you know, this weighting scheme? If you were to do it completely differently, would you get flip-flop of the results, or does it just wiggle a little bit depending on how you weight them?
That's, you know, I haven't thought of that actually, but that's an excellent question offhand. That's
I think you can see, you know, the quality, all the centers are
Sure.
to the right
Sure.
of
Yeah, that's
zero.
right.
yeah.
Duration, the same effort, all the centers.
At least for quality. For the other two, there's
Yeah,
more.
it's a little bit more of a
Right.
mixed picture. Exactly.
But the trend is.
But I'm wondering if there's some statistical technique for showing that it doesn't actually matter what your weighting scheme is, or it doesn't matter much, or something.
Yeah, I mean, for starters, I could imagine that we just give each of them an equal weight. You know, throw away this idea of weighting it by the confidence interval, and then seeing if it really mucks with the answer at all. I didn't think to do that, but that's an excellent thought. Okay. So anyway, I know I've kind of skipped all over the world here, and I apologize for that. But what I was trying to show was, you know, coming back to this idea of how do we put together a body of evidence, you know, that would allow me to say that this technique is going to be good for certain things and this other one not, you know, given so many of these difficulties that I've shown here.
Sorry, so one more thing before
Sure.
we advance. So,
it seems like part of what made this exercise particularly nice compared to some of the previous ones, really clean compared to some of the other ones you showed us, is that there was so much more agreement between the different experiments.
Right, exactly.
Does that represent a kind of maturity process of the ESE field? I mean, is there just getting to be more agreement over time so that these meta-analyses are easier to do?
I think that that's part of it, actually. I mean, I think that in the beginning there was a real bias against replicating someone else's study, because it's just, in some ways it's not as much. Exactly. So I think that we're seeing within the experimental software engineering community some of that going away. And I think also the effect that we're seeing here is that pair programming was just such a hot topic, that even if people weren't aware of each other's studies, they might have all kind of conglomerated on this particular topic to get some kind of results out.
I mean, actually, do you have a classification of these into sort of the classroom versus industry? Is there more industrial representation here, or like compared to your other?
Question. If you look in the paper, this was one that I wrote up for the column in IEEE software, and I know in that paper we talked about how much of them were industry and how many of them were with students. I can't remember offhand. I want to say it's maybe 50-50, but that's a wild guess, truly. So, okay, let me, okay, so anyway, what I hope at least I've given some examples that, through these empirical studies, we get some kind of useful insights that, can help us make useful decisions in practice. I think I've shown for sure that abstracting conclusions isn't straightforward. That I can look at the same studies and try and say that this leads up to something, but at some point there's a judgment call in here. And a lot of it has things to do with the issues that were raised today. How do I trust certain studies over another? Do I care about students versus industry? Does the confidence interval really indicate something, or does it just mean that there was truly a large confidence interval for that phenomenon? Hopefully, I showed the idea that going through these different studies can actually help aid tech transfer. We've been working in a model for a while now where we see university as a laboratory for industry. We try some of these things out in the small, find out, get the bugs worked out, see if there's really any promise to these things, and then do pilot studies in industry with less risk than if we just dump some new idea on folks. And I think we also need industry for focusing on, for getting the university studies actually focused on things that can make a difference in the field. What was needed was a body of knowledge. One study I think would not have given us, much of a sense that there's a real phenomenon out there. Looking across several studies, however, I think we can get at least a sense, like you said, about whether things line up and whether there's a consistency in the answers. And there's a need to look at different contexts to see if things really do vary from different types of studies and different types of environments. But it's a long-term process. I think you can see some of the challenges now when we try and say that these are results that should be really of interest to the engineers that are in the field actually applying some of these techniques. That we have a hard time making the transfer in a way sometimes. So some of the work that I've been doing has really been focusing on, well, how do we support this process a little better? How can we communicate to the customers that empirical study has a role to play here, that it says something useful. And so at the end, what I would like to do, I know I'm running a little late, is just to kind of circle back again and say, well, what have we learned from all this? What have we learned from all these difficulties that now we had to try and address the DoD's concern about, well, how do I put together a system that can kind of operationally help build up these bodies of knowledge? Okay. So this is a collaboration that we've done at the Fraunhofer with a number of different folks. I think the primary one, DAU, is Defense Acquisition University, which is a university within the Defense Department that teaches government folks how to, not only how to build systems and software, but actually how to manage the acquisition of systems and software. So if my developer comes to me and says, I'm building your software for the next jet fighter and we're doing X, Y, and Z, are those dangerous things? If they say they're doing pair programming, for example, should I be concerned? Should I be happy that I'm getting good benefit for my money? And so that's the audience. This is a publicly open system, by the way. So it's something that everyone can go to, contribute to, take a look at. But the primary user is really these Defense Department people that have to worry about deciding between techniques for building software and systems. Okay. What we did, looking at different practices, we've started with practices that are recommended by government and industry experts. I mean, obviously, we're not going to just throw everything into the repository. But coming back to these ideas of trustability and contextualization, we need to do a little bit more. The Defense Department actually is awash in sites that you can go to that says, here's how you should build systems, here's how you should build software. We started off this work by doing a little survey, and amazingly, everyone had the same complaints. There's too many of them. They're all a bunch of experts saying you should do it this way, and I don't know why. I don't know if they fit all the projects that I might work on. And so we've been trying to address this a little bit better here. For all the 4 examples that I gave earlier, what we've tried to do is really abstract at some level a generic process of going through. So I have to figure out what's the topic, what's the practice I'm interested in. I have to worry about my search parameters. What kinds of evidence do I care about? What sources do I want to include? What measures am I looking for? I have to actually go out and find the evidence, maybe by doing a literature survey, maybe by interviewing practitioners in the field to find out what they're doing. I have to make decisions at each of these steps, such as, do I care about expert opinion? If an expert says that they've been doing it this way and it's better than doing it, they've been doing pair programming and it's better than not, is that something that I care about? If it's someone with a lot of years of experience, I don't want to throw that knowledge away. On the other hand, it's a little bit hard to figure out how I put it in with the rest of my information. Okay. Somehow I have to filter these things, extract the content, so do some analysis of evidence. Then I have to integrate it all in a way that practitioners can come, take a look at what's there, and understand what the bottom line is without having to read all the different studies that are out there in the field. Okay. So 2 problems that we came up with immediately. One is that, as you can see, I think from any of the examples I showed, and those were some of the more promising areas where I had a lot of studies on those particular topics. For every particular practice that's out there that I might want to worry about, I don't have a bunch of studies already on it. So I have to worry about, there's insufficient studies on many topics already to allow me to build the system. Okay. And then secondly, there's users out there in the field that want this information now. They can't really wait for what could be potentially a very long research project in order to find the information, put it all together, abstract the conclusions, and communicate it out again. Okay. So what we've done is come up with a bit of a scheme behind it. And you'll have to bear with me. I never found a good way to really show you, what the system is going to look like. If I showed you screenshots, it's a bunch of pages with a bunch of text on them. It's not so interesting. So let me try and illustrate the idea behind it, and then I'll show you some at the end to let you see that it's really a real thing. Back to that idea of trustability. Our hypothesis here is that an educated guess is better than not having any information at all. But I have to tell you that it's an educated guess. If I could show you the results for pair programming, I want you to believe that's a stronger conclusion than coming back and telling you which requirements elicitation technique you should use, because there I don't have quite as much evidence, or evidence I can put together in such a rigorous way. So what we wanted to do was cast the net wide, allow all kinds of evidence to come into this thing, but put a label on it, so that you could see, well, how much evidence is there, and if I have a threshold and I want to throw some things away, that's fine. You can decide you don't want to trust evidence that's further down the case. So what we came up with was a very simple 4-step scale that talks about things like, well, how was the practice applied? Was it done was it done once in a classroom, all the way up to has it been done for many years on real production projects? Okay, so I give some amount of points based on that. How were they measured? Which goes from, was it somebody's opinion, all the way up to, I have, I'm a CMMI level 5 company and I have all the reams of data I could show you if you really care about it. How was it reported? Was it an anecdote that I've heard? Was it an interview we did someone? All the way up to it's been through peer review and it's out there in TSC. And then finally, who reported it? Was it someone, a university professor who didn't really have insight into what the team was actually doing, or was it someone on that engineering team that actually was applying the things? Again, is there a magic behind this? Is there a really rigorous way we can defend this? No, it's really a bit of a subjective scale. We started out looking at the medical literature, where they've worried a lot about how I put together a lot of different medical studies. And bless their hearts, they can ask questions like, what was the level of statistical significance, and what level of accuracy were the measurements reported. I mean, they're so far beyond what's in the software engineering literature. So we did have to kind of scale ourselves back and find ourselves into a position we can try and deal with things and separate useful things out. What we use this for is that then I could come in and say, well, here's a bar going from 0, completely untrustable evidence, up to 20 points is the maximum, so very highly trustable evidence. I can show you for a given practice how much evidence we have about it. So here I think we had this is formal inspections, let's say. So we had maybe 12 pieces of evidence here, and I can show you where on the scale they fall. So the idea is you get a little bit of clearly we need to work with the user interface expert, by the way. But you can see here that I get at least a sense about where's the evidence. How much do I really know about this particular practice? And I can differentiate something that's fairly mature, like inspections, where things tend to congregate down this end, from something like maybe Scrum, let's say, where I would have a lot of things down here in the more anecdotal end. What we're trying to do with this is to kind of convince people, we make the scale, we publish that out there so I understand where these numbers are coming from. Trying to get people to think about, well, how can I get further up? If I have a very weak piece of evidence, well, what can I do to make it better? Gee, I can collect more rigorous measures. I can go through peer review. Get people thinking about what makes good evidence and what engineers can use here.
So just to understand this a little bit, so if I'm like a practitioner then wanting to take some action, the idea is that I could come and see, pair programming, I would at least understand that, some stuff has been done and it's maybe been, at least if I'm evaluating like different techniques and I see this, I could say, there seems to be a lot more evidence in this area than that. But then when it comes to sort of the particular actions I take, I still have, there's still a lot of decisions.
Exactly.
So these are this is like at a macro level more, like subject A, do I do A versus B, but not necessarily how I do A.
Exactly. So
is that the way to?
Exactly right. So there's really two dimensions, and the how-to, or what it really means for me, I'll get to in just a second.
Okay.
But this is, like you said, exactly. This is just to let me come and get a sense about. What we'd also like to do is get some of the things coming out of the research labs. So I might come and see a practice where I just have one little piece of evidence here. It might be really promising, but I better go into it with my eyes open, saying, "Geez, there's not a lot of real experience here yet."
So how much have you actually built up? I mean, it seems valuable as we're maturing as a discipline, but it seems like how do you get this database populated? And Wikipedia has this great effect where people like to write about their subjects, but how do you get people to actually do this? I mean, how did you do this?
Yes, well, we just went live with it actually in January of this year, and what we're so kind of working behind the scenes. I think we have I want to say about 40 practices and 100 pieces of evidence. So you can see, some of these have a lot, and then you have a lot where we don't have very much evidence at all yet. And what we're trying to do, I'll show you in just a little bit how what we're collecting, but we're trying to get some of that Wikipedia effect, actually. We're trying to get a user community where people can come in and say, the evidence you have is wrong. Here, I used it, here's what it did. People can be anonymous.
So it is open.
It is,
It's
exactly.
open in the sense not just being on the web, but
oh yes, I'm sorry. Exactly.
You're actually soliciting input and people can change it.
Yes, exactly.
Just anybody can come in from outside?
Anybody can come in and submit. And then we have a team on the inside kind of that processes things. Really what we do is if something comes in, we send it off to a subject matter expert in the area. And then they look at it and say, yes, exactly. So it's kind of we try and catch some of the Wikipedia, and have it, obviously, we had visions, let's say, of it being a lot more open and community organized in the beginning, and that doesn't work so well with the DoD environment necessarily.
So I still don't quite understand this approach. So I don't quite understand how 12 different experiences can be put on the same scale, in that each experience might represent a different claim about whatever the subject is, right?
Right.
So one might just be that, oh, pair programming is better than not. And the other one might be that pair programming gives you a 17% productivity boost. And the third one might be that, oh, pair programming gives you a 23% quality boost.
Right, exactly.
So I don't understand how those can all be accumulated on the one scale.
They're not. So this is, like I said, this is just one dimension. It kind of gives me a sense of, how, there's a summary that pulls that part together that I'll get to in just a second. And this just tells me a little bit about how much do we really know about what goes into that.
This scale would be attached to a sentence or something, right, that makes some claim.
Right.
Right? So where's that claim come from?
Mm-hmm. Well, this would be attached to a whole practice. This just says how much do we really know about pair programming, or how much do we really know about formal inspections. Let me just skip ahead here. And this is the part where it gets a little cartoony, so bear with me. But what we're really doing is we have a data structure for each piece of evidence we come in. Okay? And what I was trying to show here with my icons is that some of this might be something from the literature, that someone's published and said we use this particular technique. Some of these might be interviews we've done with folks in the field, where we can go solicit things. Some of these are DoD guidebooks, that say this is a practice you should be doing. What we have, we have much more than 3 fields, but they're all grouped together into tell me something about the source. So is this a published paper? Has it been peer reviewed? How much trust do I have in the publication itself? The context. So was this a co-located team or one that was distributed all over? Was it a fixed wing aircraft or a business system? And then what the results were. And as you said, everyone's going to, what we do is just collect text and we try and accumulate it into 3 buckets: cost, quality, schedule. So like you said, for each of these, maybe this one says pair programming was 17% better than not. This one might just say, geez, we've been doing pair programming for a while and we swear by it. We think it's much better than the other approach. So there's specific things here where each piece of evidence goes into one of these templates. We extract the pieces that we're interested in particularly. And then we have a rating scale. So I could say, well, for this practice, we might just have bronze level information. We only have the evidence there yet. When we get to a sufficient point where we have enough evidence, one of the subject matter experts gets the job of pulling it all together. And again, we had to do it textually. As much as we would have loved to do something numeric, the examples I tried to show were saying, for many practices, we just don't have that out there yet. So some expert writes a summary that says, well, where have we seen it being used? Maybe it's only been used on large projects, but not small ones, for example. What kind of benefits have we seen? And again, these have to be broken down by, well, we always saw a benefit on large systems, but for small ones, it was too much overhead. It wasn't really worthwhile. How do I get started with it? And then pointers down to these guys. So if I'm really interested, I can get some information on demand, for example. I might only be worried about this context. This might be the only one that matches mine. So I might want to look at this paper, or at least what I've extracted from it, and ignore those other 3 things. Okay. But again, we also have the trouble of, a lot of subject matter experts can make a good story through the evidence, but how do I have any kind of confidence in it? So again, our gold level for getting the content there is to send this off to basically be peer reviewed. So we have other experts from government, industry, academia that will then vet the information, have the ability to say things like, geez, it's a nice story, but you only talk to people that are really advocates of this thing. You better go, I know other people have had negative results with it. You better get their input too. Okay. Or, geez, what you said is true, but you wrote a book, and no engineer's ever going to have time to read it all, so can we cut it back a little bit? Okay, so we do have kind of an internal feedback on the quality there also. Okay. And then just to point out that as we're building it kind of bottom up, I accumulate the evidence, I try and put it together by some subject matter expert. Users are really coming in from the top down. So they'll do a query on the interface that might say, I'm looking for practices that reduce schedule. They get directed to whatever practice this might be. Then I might say, gee, I'm on a safety critical program. I don't really care if they've used it in academia. So show me what kind of evidence comes from safety critical programs. So I can see the template, and if I really want to, I could go read the paper, or see the whole interview if I want. So the idea of kind of, you only have to drill down and see as much information as you're really interested in, particularly.
Are the kind of context settings for this?
Mm-hmm. By schematized, you mean how many different attributes do we use there?
Yeah. are they attribute based? Are they narrative based?
Yeah. Well, some of this, when I pulled together the information that says what do we know about the cost, quality, schedule, that's more of a narrative based information. For each piece of evidence, we have a set of metadata, that says things like what's the domain. Was it government? Was it industry? Was it academia? I'm trying to think. There's 10 fields altogether, and I can't. Of course, I just went blank. But each of those has a set of predefined values, and so I basically select them here, and then at this level, I can tell you it's only been used in government. It's only been used in industry, something like that.
So this is sort of like getting a little towards semantic web. Somehow you're creating a little bit of an ontology for this area. I guess my main concern is do we really have enough data? Is there enough? I mean, how long? I mean, how big are the other? Maybe the more positive way to say this. How big a project is this? How do you know when you're done? Of course, people are always doing new studies, but still, you can look back and say, it took so many years for us to it took us so long to index the web. Google. Yes. I mean, given all the knowledge we have up to date now, how much effort would it really take to build this ontology?
So there's two interesting questions there. One is the point you made about semantic web, for example. That's something that we would like to, I think as we get a little bit more mature here, we would like to work with folks that are doing research in that area, to see if they can help us automate some of this, to help see if we can learn things. The other question about how much work is it, I think you could spend a lifetime on it, truthfully. And so what we're doing is we have a user advisory group. So we meet with them periodically and say, give us 4 practice areas we can get our arms around. So they'll say things like risk management. I'm trying to think of the top ones. Risk management, requirements engineering. So we're at least trying to look within smaller sets of things rather than get the whole universe and put it in here right now. Okay. So anyway, now that you've borne through the cartoons, here's just a screenshot that says, geez, this is actually a real system. If you like, you can go take a look at it. People always forget the S. For whatever reason, it's an HTTPS address. But you can go there, take a look, play around, go browse. And we'd be thrilled, I think, to get input from anyone in this room, actually. As we go forward, I think that, so there's technical decisions we've made based on the evidence out there and how hard or difficult it will be to put it together in a meaningful way. I think what we really need to worry about now is not so much technical issues as collaborative ones. We really need to grow this community of subject matter experts. Like you said, we need to really, I think to be successful at all, we need to get some of that same community spirit, for example, that infuses Wikipedia. We need people to put things in. We need people to not be afraid about saying, that's a load of whatever. Here's my experience. It's completely different from what you have there so far.
Is one of the issues, though, that there's so much religion in this place that independent experts are going to be very difficult to find.
That's one of the things that worries us, actually. I think that at least we can try and address that somewhat by asking people, well, what's your evidence? Part of the decision can be made based on how much concrete information they can actually put into the evidence fields, if you will. Now we haven't actually gotten through so many. Well, the idea of having each of the practice things being reviewed by an outside objective team. We haven't done so many of those yet. The ones that we've done have been fairly collaborative, I guess. I think as we get to some of the more contentious topics, I think there'll be a little bit more disagreement back and forth. And so I think that's something we just have to kind of play with and see how it goes as we get there. But that's a good point.
It also seems like the whole approach has a little bit of a feedback loop problem as well. In that, if I'm a user of this thing, I'll go in and I'm going to want to do the practices that have the best evidence associated with it. Right? So therefore, I go and I do it, and now I have experience, and I enter my experience into the system under that, which piles up even more evidence in favor of that thing. So the things that start out with the most initial evidence are going to get the most evidence because people are going to head there, and the things that are maybe way better, like much bigger improvements in quality or productivity or whatever, but maybe don't have as much evidence,
people will shy away from, right? So it'll be harder for new things to kind of break in because there's this feedback effect.
That's a very interesting idea. I hadn't, to be truthful, I get maybe more hopeful, but than saying I have a real rigorous way for saying this. But I've been hopeful that if we can put out some of the things that come out of the labs, that there's a class of early adopters out there that are going to say, even though there's not a lot of evidence, that sounds really nifty to me. I'm hoping that we can actually, there's stakeholders in this also. If I'm a researcher in a lab and I come up with a new approach to testing, let's say, and I put it out there, I have an incentive to go out and try and get it into work. And when I do case studies, put them back in there. So we're hoping to get a little bit of competition between some of the stakeholders in this to help put the practices together. But as you said, it's very hard to kind of predict how the community is going to go with this. And so I'm looking forward to it, though, but we'll see.
Are there any other kinds of communities like this? I would think that CMU would be wanting to do something like this.
We were involved, not with CMU, but we were talking to SCI a lot in the beginning. Now, SCI is kind of an opposite point of view, where they really do more of a kind of a mode where they make the decisions and then kind of push it out to the community. So I think there's a lot of their advice that they give that we can collect evidence on, and try and build up in here also. In terms of a collaborative workspace, though, I think they were anxious to play along and have some control over what we're saying about some of their techniques, but they weren't going to put a lot of resources into helping us build it. So.
And certainly, the discussion groups, these kinds of things would be debated ad nauseum already, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Exactly. And I should say, too, that it's not really as much a standalone system as I may have just made it sound, but the Defense University has a large set of interconnected resources, where we're going to be a plug-in, I guess, to the rest of this collaborative workspace they have. So in a way, it's not like we're starting with our 3 folks and saying, okay, let's build a huge community, but there are discussion groups and forums and people that are interested in these types of issues already out there that I hope are going to help us build this. Okay. Great. Oh, so anyway, just to sum up, so as an empirical software engineer, I like to think we have good examples of how the field has matured, as somebody said, of how we've been using measurement to try to drive good ideas into practice and do it in a controlled way, without the risk of taking something brand new and just dropping it out there into an industry engineering team. I think I've also at least tried to make the argument that having a single study or a single piece of evidence on some of these decisions is not really what we need in order to be convincing to the engineers that we need to work with, in order to convince people to try and adopt some of the new technologies that are coming out. So, I think that as we go forward, not only do we have the challenge of doing good studies and continuing to build the field that way, but more importantly, in some ways, I think we have the challenge of really communicating the results in a good way to the engineers and the people in the field that should be making decisions, I hope, based on some of these things. No study is perfect. There's always going to be the problem that we're dealing with human subjects, that we have a limited amount of control over some of the things we're trying to study. But I think that by really having a good dialogue and a rational discussion about these things, we can try and make it clear what is the real benefit to these studies. And I don't know that there's much of a reason for doing these studies if we're not trying to have some kind of impact on industry and practitioners. Okay. So time will tell, and whether or not this particular clearinghouse approach is workable and useful. But if nothing else, I would look forward to coming back in a few years and letting you know. I'll either have some great success stories or some interesting lessons from the field about what we did wrong and what we want to do right the next time. Okay. So thank you for your attention. Any last questions? Okay. Great. Thank you.